Thursday, but because of the break in the middle of the week, I think I just want to give an overview ahead of time. And if we want to do a review on Thursday, we can always do that too. But I'll just try to give you like a heads up on like what's coming. I'm uploading that video right now on using WebMock and VCR for testing API calls. But there's a separate piece here as well, like when it comes to testing OmniAuth or OAuth. So if you hand roll OAuth, the OAuth handshake, testing it becomes a lot more difficult. If you think about like the stuff that we did this morning, where was all that code living?
In the sessions controller.
Yeah, it was at the controller layer, right? How have you tested controllers in the past?
Basically, tested
Successful
views.
response.
Yeah, so like you kind of test it indirectly by making an API call, or like when you write your request specs, it has to hit the controller, but you're not testing the controller directly. Or when you test it right at a feature test, you're kind of in a way testing the controller, but not directly, right? So having that code live at the controller layer becomes really tricky to test. There are controller tests, and they are nice to use from time to time, but the logic that's in there is like too much to be living inside of the controller. If I were to hand roll the handshake, at some point I would try to move that into a service and have like small methods, which would then be like easier to test. But having the entire handshake in one controller action is going to make it really difficult to like stub the responses out and all of that. And what will end up happening is anytime you want to run your test suite, you would almost have to run through the real like OAuth handshake, which if you ever try to write a test around that, is really difficult, because now you're not just like trying to hit stuff inside of your own application. You are now like being redirected in that handshake, right, to GitHub. And then you would need to fill out the forms on GitHub and then be redirected back to your application and all of that. There are ways to do it, but it's really tricky, and it's totally not worth it. So what the general consensus is to use something like OmniAuth, like an OmniAuth gem. So what we'll be expecting is not that you hand roll the whole process. The reason we showed it that way is so you have an understanding of what's happening under the hood. I think when it seems like a magical process, it's like a lot less likely that you're going to know where to troubleshoot if something goes wrong. Whereas if you've seen the whole process done by hand, you now know roughly like where to go. And we've seen like a big improvement in students like retention and understanding of not just OAuth, but as like API consumption in general when rolling it all from scratch, at least one time just to see it. So what we'll be expecting on the project is that you use something like OmniAuth Twitter, or I'm sorry, GitHub. And all of the OmniAuth implementations that I'm aware of have, so there's like multiple OmniAuth. It's not unique to GitHub, right? There's OmniAuth Facebook and OmniAuth Google, I think, maybe, I don't know. But there's a bunch of OmniAuth implementations out there. And almost all of them that I've seen, actually all of them that I've seen have had this thing called OmniAuth MockAuth. And I think it's something like this. But if you do a Google search for OmniAuth MockAuth, I might have the syntax a little bit wrong. There's a way to basically configure OmniAuth to be in test mode. So it'll prevent real calls from being made. So you'll set that inside of your test suite. You'll basically set OmniAuth to be in test mode. So you'll set it. And again, I forget exactly the syntax, but I just want to give you a high level like overview of what's happening. So you'll set it to test mode, and then you'll have access to this thing called OmniAuth MockAuth. And then there's this like auth, I think it's like auth hash that they give you. Oops. There's a tutorial that did you see anyone's take a look at the Twitter? There's like an OmniAuth Twitter tutorial that I think Mike posted on Friday or mentioned it. It's in the lesson plan for today, and y'all should like reference that as you're working through GitHub because it'll kind of show how to do this. But basically, this auth hash is like a different. You can interact with it as if it were a hash, but you can also use dot notation on it. So like instead of just like the square bracket accessing of things, you'll see dot notation and the square brackets. It's just a special kind of hash. If you're interested in what kind of hash what that is, there's a gem out there that's called hash with indifferent access. And that's what that is. I think it's just a gem that you can pull into your projects if you ever wanted to use it. So anyways, setting it to test mode prevents the real HTTP request from going out and hitting real GitHub. And then this auth hash should mirror the data that you would get back. So at the end of the handshake process, you got a bunch of data back about that user, and there's like some other stuff in there. You need to make sure that this auth hash mirrors that data. Because basically what's going to happen is it's going to take this, instead of doing the real call, it's going to take whatever is in here and send that back. And so if the structure of this hash differs from the real API call differs from what you do here, your code is going to break somewhere. Either your test is going to break, or when you switch over and you make the real API call from in dev or production mode, that will break. So they have to match exactly. You don't need to have all of the data in both of them, just the data you care about. So like let's say you're grabbing the token and the username. You need to make sure that the structure of the hash matches with the structure that you would get back, and that the keys are exactly the same and that sort of thing. Questions about that so far? I'm going to draw a diagram in just a second about to try to solidify it. But I just wanted to kind of talk briefly about these pieces. Cool. All right, so here's what'll happen. You have your test suite here, and we'll say we got your typical Rails app here. And then over here, we'll have a little GitHub thing. Typically what will happen is when you're working with when you're in dev mode, which is what you saw in the class session, you'll go do the whole handshake and everything kind of goes back. And then we get back our data. And then at some point, we're probably storing this in our database. Whoops. What'll happen with once we do all of that stuff over there, once we set it into test mode, it basically creates a little bit of a barrier and prevents us from making the real API call. So our spec will run, and because we've set it into test mode, it'll basically be oh, we're not going to make the real call. Instead, I'm going to look for the return value from this OmniAuth mock-auth, and it'll just send it back. And this will be our data. But it never actually makes the real API call. So it never makes it over here. So what that means is that this data here and this data here they have to be, the structures need to match. If they don't, when we go to store it in the database, we're going to run into problems because it won't, like either the columns won't match up or the fields, the keys won't match up or whatever. We'll run into problems. Questions about that so far? Cool. Where it gets really interesting, so this stuff here, this is all of this is OAuth. What's going to happen is after we do like the OAuth stuff, we're going to need to go make real API calls with the token that we get back. So the whole goal or the whole purpose of doing this whole thing is to get a token. So at the end of everything that happens here, we end up with a token. So kind of like when we're in development mode and we're in production mode, when we make the real API call, we get back a real token. What do you think we need to do then when we're in test mode? I'll kind of follow up with another question. When we're in test mode, do you think we make real API calls at any point?
No.
Why not?
Rate limits.
Sure.
Because the data might change, like the form of the data coming back might change over time.
Totally, yeah. So this is where it's kind of a trick question, because like the reality is like sometimes you might want to make a real API call from your test suite, and sometimes you might not. I try to avoid it as much as possible. So I tend to lean towards this tool called WebMock, which is in the video that I uploaded kind of shows that. Let's see. So like I'll just kind of like put down over here. This is like our API calls. Anytime we make the API call, we're going to use the tokens that we've saved to make them. If we're using WebMock, WebMock does like a similar thing where if we're running our spec, we're going to, if we're using WebMock or VCR, they tend, let's just talk about WebMock first. The way WebMock works is it's basically we tell WebMock, hey, watch out for this URL that we're going to be making an HTTP request to. And you might say, when I'm going to send a GET request to this particular endpoint through the API, we don't want you to make the real call. Just stop in the middle and then return whatever data we want. The video will kind of explain that more in detail so that when we run our test suite, it's like, oh, WebMock has a filter to catch this particular HTTP call. So we're just going to return fixture data. In which case, we don't ever need a real token. However, sometimes you're going to want to make a real call, and if you've never used WebMock before, the easiest place to start when you're writing your tests is to use a real token and just make a real API call. So in the video that Mike uploaded over the weekend, we were making real API calls from there, and we just set the token up inside of our Figaro file, the application.yaml, to make the real calls. So if you're using WebMock, you don't do it, but since this is the first time you're building a project like this, I would actually recommend storing a real token in Figaro. So the way that might look is like in your application.yaml, you might do maybe like GitHub user token. And this would be like application.yaml. And this would point to a real token. How would you get this token? Any ideas?
You'd say like you'd access the env hash, env, and then GitHub user token.
Yeah, so that's how you would end up using it, right? So like in your test, you could reference env GitHub user token. How do you get a real token though to store inside of the application.yaml? Any thoughts?
Do you have to actually log in and go through the process?
Yeah.
To get it open?
Yeah, so there's two options, right? Like option one is exactly that. Like you go through the real handshake process through your app, maybe in development mode, take the token, and then store it inside of your application.yaml file. That's option one. Option two is another nice thing about GitHub is they will actually let you create tokens through the web interface. So if you go through the web interface on GitHub, they'll create a token. You can create a token through there. I forget exactly where it is, but just like know that it's there. That's the way I would do it. I think those tokens last longer. I don't think they expire as quickly, and so that's probably what I would do. So this real token, I would create through the GitHub UI. That way, you don't have to worry about setting up webmock and having all this extra overhead for you to get the ball rolling. I think that this is a great place to end up a little bit later in the project, but I would follow the same like kind of order that we did it in the video, where we just didn't worry about webmock or VCR to start with. We just wanted to start making real API calls from our test suite, at which point we can mock it out. In the future, once you understand all the concepts, I think it's fine to start just like mocking things out right away. But I think there's like that introduces a lot more moving parts, which is more confusing. So that means that from the test suite, you're probably gonna you could use something like FactoryBot, and then have like a token field within FactoryBot that references env GitHub user token, and then just like set it manually there. So this piece, this OmniAuth mock-auth, probably only gets used maybe 1 or 2 times in the test suite for logging in. But from then on out, I'm just gonna try to like stub out the user method, like current user, the same way that you've done in the past, and then use the GitHub user token that's in my environment variable, env GitHub user token, within that factory. And then so it would be like allow any instance of current application controller to return current user, to receive current user and return a user with this particular field set. Yeah.
Could you also mock at that, like use
Yep.
webmock at that point, so that still works?
Well,
Like webmock a user, so like if you didn't want to use a real token.
so webmock gets used for mock or like stubbing and mocking out HTTP requests. In the scenario of a user, you don't technically need to log in every time, right? So the OAuth handshake only happens when you're logging in, but once someone's logged in, you don't need OAuth anymore. So you could just do the same way that you've stubbed out current user in the past. You could do that the same way here, and you wouldn't. So for most of the tests, you wouldn't actually need to log in or use OmniAuth at all. Just the process of logging in. But then every other page that you're visiting, you could just visit the page with a mock, like stubbing out current user the same way you've done in the past. It's just that the user that you stub out will have a factory that has maybe like so you might have like user factory that has a token field that happens to point to env GitHub user token. Oops. So this will actually prevent you from needing to go through the OAuth handshake. The whole purpose of the OAuth handshake is to get what? token, right? So if we manually have created a token and we have a factory that has access to it, we don't need to go through the handshake anymore. We can just say, allow any instance of the application controller to receive current user and return this user here. And we don't, does that make sense? This is like a lot of moving parts. And this is like what I mean, like this is the part of the project that I think is the most challenging, is when you start getting into like testing and all of that. Yeah.
You're gonna make a video, or you already did?
Have a video on testing the API calls
Oh, okay.
using WebMock and VCR. We don't have anything for the OAuth handshake.
So just read the documentation, do the Twitter.
The Twitter tutorial does show how to do it,
Okay.
but for Twitter, it doesn't show how to do it with GitHub. Yeah. But there is a difference between like mocking out the data here for OmniAuth and OAuth, and then mocking out the data for like API calls. It's confusing. But I wanted to give like one high level overview before you start jumping in, and then when you start like kind of moving through it and trying to make sense of it, we'll be around to answer those questions too. But don't worry, this is like super confusing and kind of weird, and it will take some time to get used to. Yeah.
So we do want, I'm just making sure I have them separate in my head.
Hmm?
We do want to go ahead and mock out with OmniAuth, the one over here on this side, but for now we want to test with real API calls and then maybe implement that later.
Exactly. Great. Yeah, I actually did. I wasn't very clear about that. Thank
I
you.
want to make sure.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, so I would start with, if you're going to be testing logging in, automatically start trying to use the mock auth stuff, because you're not going to be able to, well, there are ways to like do the real login process, but it's really tricky. You'll have to install like these other gems. Like there's like, I think you can use this gem called Water, which will allow you to fill out forms on an external server and like all this other stuff. Totally overkill, not worth it. So I would say for the logging in, start with this stuff here. But for when it comes time to start making API calls, once you get the token, don't worry about using WebMock and VCR yet. Just like give it a moment to kind of sink in, and don't worry if like the testing part of this takes you like till the end of the week to kind of wrap your head around. That's why we usually have a session on Thursday about testing, is because it's like it's a lot. But because we're not going to be here Wednesday, I kind of wanted to like cover this a couple times throughout the week. And then the last tool that's in that video, I'll just give a brief diagram because I usually do it in the class and I didn't do it in the video, is VCR. Again, this is for making API calls, has nothing to do with OAuth. Is that the way VCR works is WebMock basically never allows the HTTP call to be made. The way VCR works is that if it has what it refers to as cassettes that it stores inside of a fixtures directory. And if it has a cassette for a particular endpoint, it will use the cassette to do basically the same thing. But if it doesn't have a cassette, it will go make the real call and then record a cassette with the data it gets back. So where that's nice is that sometimes if you want to make a real HTTP request, you have the ability to do that, but then also like stub things, or like, yeah, stub the response back most of the time. Where that's useful is I like to use that at the service layer. So like my feature tests and like other, like any like integration test, I tend to use WebMock for them. But for my service test, so if I'm testing at the unit layer inside of the class that's actually making the real API call, I will tend to write those tests using VCR. Because what I want to know about is if the structure of the API response I get back changes, I want to know about that because my code is dependent on it. Whereas like something like WebMock is never, like, will never know if the API changes. Something like VCR will. Yeah.
How will it know if it stores a cassette? Like, I understand we're recording the call, right?
Great.
So if I make the call one time and then it changes, why
Yeah.
would it go back and
Great question.
how would it know? up.
Yeah. So like the general like approach is that like you'll have some sort of background task that will like clear out your cassettes occasionally. So you usually do this like through like a continuous integration server or something like that, where you have like this like server that you'll deploy to that'll like run the test suite against like a bunch of different environments. And what it'll do is like it'll like, I don't know, every night at midnight clear out all the cassettes and then run it against, like, make sure that all of the API endpoints are for real, that nothing's changed. If something's changed, then we'll get failures, and then we'll know about those changes. But when, as developers on the team, what we probably do is keep the cassettes in there pretty much all the time, so that way none of us need like real API keys and stuff like that, and it'll just like allow us to develop things a little bit faster. But then we still have this option to be like, you know what, we're going to clear out the cassettes every night at midnight just to make sure everything is like connected. So when we're using VCR, I'll kind of do that here. First time we make the call, it actually goes out to GitHub and then pulls back the response. And when it gets back, it records it as a cassette. The second time we make the call, it kind of does the same thing that WebMock does. It goes out, starts the request, realizes I've got a cassette for that, and then it just returns that data back. Every night at midnight, we might go delete our cassettes, and then it goes through the whole process again, or whatever time.
Where does it store those cassettes?
You can tell it wherever you want.
Okay.
In the video that I do, I create a fixtures directory at the root of the project, and inside of there I create a VCR cassettes directory. So it's like fixtures, VCR cassettes. But you could put them literally wherever you wanted, and it'll automatically create the directory if it's not there and all of that. Cool. This is like information that usually comes later in the week. So don't be surprised if if this felt like, oh my God. It's okay. Just wanted to kind of like throw it out there one time. Let stick whatever will stick, and then like later in the week we'll come back to it and we'll talk about it. Feel free to ask more questions. There's the videos. There's some written up tutorials and stuff out there that we have links to. The Twitter tutorial and then the testing video that I just uploaded are like the two best resources to kind of like wrap your head around this. But feel free to ask lots of questions because this stuff is tricky. Cool. Sorry, that was a lot of information. Cool. Any questions?
All the questions?
All the questions, yeah. I would say just start playing around with it, see how it goes. If it goes terribly, let us know, and we'll be there to help. Cool? Awesome. Thanks a lot.